The air inside the St. Regis ballroom tasted of expensive champagne, white hydrangeas, and my family's complete contempt. I took a seat in the third row, smoothing the fabric of my navy silk dress. Around me, high society whispers blended with the classical quartet playing near the altar. This was my sister Victoria's wedding day, a multi-million-dollar merger disguised as romance, orchestrated entirely by our mother, Eleanor Wells. I was adjusting my program when a shadow fell over me. It wasn't a family member. It was Julian, the chief event coordinator, flanked by two burly security guards in tailored suits. His face held the practiced neutrality of someone paid to remove stains from luxury carpets. "Excuse me, miss," Julian whispered, his voice cutting through the soft violin music. "Can I please have your name?" "Myra Wells," I said clearly. "I'm the bride's sister." Julian glanced down at his leather-bound tablet, his stylus hovering. He scrolled once, twice. Then he looked up, a cold, patronizing pity settling into his eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Wells. Your name is not on the final approved seating chart. In fact, it is explicitly flagged on our security manifesto." A few heads turned in the row ahead of us. Mrs. Harrison, a notorious gossip from my mother's country club, shifted in her seat to get a better view. "There must be a mistake," I said, keeping my voice low and level. I didn't flinch. I didn't flush. My mother told me the ceremony started at 4. "There is no mistake," Julian replied, his tone sharpening. "We have strict orders from the maternal matriarch. The guest list is capped, and your credentials were removed 48 hours ago. I'm going to have to ask you to stand up and follow us to the exit immediately. We cannot have a scene before the bridal party arrives." The whispers spread like a stain on silk. "Is that Myra? Why is she being escorted out?" I heard Eleanor cut her off completely. The judgment in the room was palpable, a collective suffocating sneer from 150 of the city's most prominent elite. They looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a pristine gallery. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother. She answered on the second ring. In the background, I could hear Victoria laughing, clinking glasses with her bridesmaids. "Mom," I said, my voice deadpan, "security is asking me to leave. They say my name isn't on the list." A heavy, deliberate sigh traveled through the receiver. "Myra, don't do this today," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with calculated exhaustion. "Victoria's wedding is being covered by Vogue. The seating is highly curated. We have senators here. We have Julian's tech investors. You don't fit the aesthetic, darling. You haven't for years. Frankly, your father and I didn't think you'd actually show up and embarrass us. Did you honestly think you were invited to a function of this caliber? You sent me the itinerary, Mom. An administrative error by my assistant," she snapped. "Hand your phone to security. Walk out quietly. Don't ruin your sister's perfect day with your pathetic need for attention. If you cause a scene, I will ensure your trust fund distribution is permanently audited." "Goodbye, Mom," I said. I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood up, adjusting my posture, and looked Julian directly in the eyes. The security guards braced themselves, expecting a breakdown, a scream, a plea. I gave them nothing but a calm, vacant stare. "I'll find my own way out," I told him. As I walked down the long, mirrored aisle, a gauntlet of judging eyes tracked my every step. Victoria's friends hid their smirks behind manicured hands. My father stood near the front, looking right through me as if I were made of glass, adjusting his tuxedo cuffs without a hint of remorse. At the concierge desk outside the ballroom doors, I stopped. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, heavy silver box wrapped in a deep crimson ribbon. It looked like a high-end jewelry piece, anonymous and elegant. Inside was a flash drive and a single sheet of notarized financial ledgers dating back 7 years. I placed it on the velvet-covered gift table. "Make sure this goes directly to the bride's table before the reception begins," I told the attendant. "Tell her it's a foundational gift from her sister, something to build her new life on." The attendant nodded, entirely unaware of the fuse I had just lit. I walked out of the St. Regis, stepped into my waiting car, and watched the hotel fade into the distance. My family thought they had stripped me of my dignity in front of everyone who mattered to them. They didn't realize that by locking me out of the room, they had ensured I wouldn't be caught in the blast radius. 2 hours from now, the reception would begin. 2 hours from now, the real gift would be opened. What do you think is waiting for Victoria inside that silver box? Let me know your theories in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories every day. The drive away from the St. Regis was silent. I watched the city skyline flash past the tinted glass, entirely unmoved by the humiliation I had just left behind. To be cast out by Eleanor and Richard Wells was not a shock. It was the natural conclusion to a narrative they had been writing since the day I was born. In our household, affection was a finite resource, a currency fully invested in my younger sister, Victoria. Victoria was born with the exact shade of golden blonde hair my mother prized and a malleable, eager-to-please personality that could be sculpted into a high society trophy. I, on the other hand, was dark-haired, quiet, and possessed an analytical mind that my father found deeply unsettling in a daughter. Myra is just difficult, Eleanor would tell her friends over charity luncheons, while I sat 10 feet away, invisible. She lacks Victoria's warmth. She's far too cold. What they called coldness was survival. When I turned 16, I placed first in the prestigious National Economics Olympiad, beating out 300 students from the country's top private academies. I brought the heavy crystal trophy home, placing it on the mahogany dining table before dinner. My father glanced at it, turned his newspaper, and asked Victoria about her varsity cheerleading tryouts. Later that evening, the housekeeper moved my trophy to a dusty shelf in the basement to make room for Victoria's framed portrait. The pattern never broke. When Victoria crashed her first luxury SUV into a country club gate, my father paid the police, buried the report, and bought her a newer model the next morning. When I requested a modest loan to fund a summer internship at a quantitative hedge fund during my university years, Richard Wells laughed into his scotch. "A woman in quantitative finance, Myra? Don't be absurd," he'd said, his voice flat and dismissing. "We're not financing your little hobbies. Your trust fund covers your basic tuition, and frankly, that's more than enough charity. If you want play money, ask your grandfather's ghost." They wanted me weak. They wanted me dependent, a permanent foil to Victoria's glittering perfection. The only person who saw through the family theater was my maternal aunt, Clara. Clara was the black sheep, an independently wealthy venture capitalist who had severed ties with Eleanor a decade prior. She was the one who visited me in secret during my college years, sitting in a dingy diner near my campus, looking at my financial models with sharp, approving eyes. "They are terrified of you, Myra," Aunt Clara had told me, tapping a manicured finger against my notebook. Eleanor built her entire identity on being the gatekeeper of the Wells family image. Victoria is her puppet. You think in algorithms and leverage. Never let them see what you're building. When a predator thinks you're weak, they stop watching their flank. Clara taught me how to move in the dark. She didn't offer me handouts, but she gave me access to the right server rooms, the right encrypted networks, and the right offshore institutional structures. While my family spent their summers hosting lavish galas in the Hamptons, flaunting their ancestral wealth, I spent 18 hours a day in a cramped apartment coding high-frequency trading algorithms and analyzing commercial real estate debt. The day I graduated from university, my parents didn't attend the ceremony. They were in Paris, celebrating Victoria's acceptance into a boutique fashion design program, a program my father had privately funded with a $500,000 donation. I stood on the campus lawn alone, holding my degree in mathematical economics. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel abandonment. The last remaining thread of emotional attachment to the Wells name snapped cleanly inside my chest. I packed my belongings into a single suitcase, left the family estate without saying goodbye, and legally changed my personal banking routing numbers. I became a ghost to them. For the next 3 years, they only contacted me to send obligatory holiday text messages or to remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They truly believed I was struggling, living off a meager assistant salary somewhere in the city's gray periphery. They needed that lie to maintain their sense of superiority. I let them believe it. I fed their arrogance with my silence, knowing that the higher they built their pedestal, the more devastating the drop would be. The world of high finance doesn't care about ancestral names or country club pedigree. It cares about bloodless, calculated execution. For 3 years, while my family gossiped about my unfortunate lack of direction, I operated under the corporate veil of Vanguard Wells Holdings, a proprietary trading firm and private equity fund I founded with Aunt Clara's structural guidance. My parents thought my absence from their social circle was due to shame. The truth was far more clinical. I was simply too busy buying up their world. By 25, I had engineered a predictive algorithm that capitalized on short-term commercial real estate distress. I didn't buy luxury sports cars or post my life on Instagram. I poured every dollar of profit back into the firm, acquiring corporate debt, shell companies, and the underlying mortgages of the very institutions my father frequented. 6 months before Victoria's wedding, my father's primary development firm, Wells Global Development, encountered a severe liquidity crisis. A major luxury high-rise project downtown had stalled due to supply chain failures and predatory lending terms. Desperate to maintain the illusion of generational stability before Victoria married Julian's tech dynasty family, my father took out a private mezzanine loan from an anonymous institutional lender. That anonymous lender was me. I held the note on his flagship corporate headquarters. I held the personal guarantees on his secondary estates. He had signed the documents blindly, seduced by the low initial interest rates offered by my front-facing attorneys, completely unaware that the terms included an immediate acceleration clause in the event of any undisclosed regulatory audits. While I was quietly holding the financial noose around my father's neck, Victoria was still playing the role of the pampered princess. 2 weeks before the wedding, she called me for the first time in 8 months. Mira, her voice came through the line, high-pitched and dripping with condescension. I'm sending out the final itinerary for the rehearsal dinner and the main event. Look, Mom and I were talking. We really think it's best if you stay in the background. Julian's family is incredibly particular about presentation. His father is the chairman of Apex Global, you know. I am aware of who his father is, Victoria, I said, leaning back in my leather office chair, looking at a terminal that displayed Julian's family's latest quarterly portfolio losses. Right. Well, we just don't want any awkwardness, she continued, completely oblivious. You don't really have the wardrobe for this kind of event, and frankly, your career situation is a bit depressing to explain to the guests. If people ask, we're just going to say you're doing administrative consulting abroad. It sounds cleaner. Just show up, sit quietly, and don't make eye contact with the photographers. I'll ensure my presence matches exactly what the family deserves, Victoria, I replied smoothly. Good. I knew you'd understand your limitations for once, she sighed, hanging up without asking a single question about my life. The arrogance was staggering, but it was exactly what I needed. They were so blinded by their own carefully curated glare that they couldn't see the shadow I was casting over their entire empire. They truly believed I was a non-factor, a charity case allowed to exist on the margins of their gilded lives. The final piece of the trap fell into place 48 hours before the wedding, the exact moment my mother chose to remove my name from the St. Regis guest list. My legal team finalized the acquisition of the secondary debt on Julian's family's tech fund, binding the two families together in a single, fragile financial web. They wanted a wedding that would cement their status as untouchable elites. They wanted a public display of perfection, using my exclusion as the ultimate punctuation mark to prove I didn't belong. They didn't know that the silver box I left on the gift table didn't just contain a flash drive. It contained the foreclosure notices, the debt acceleration triggers, and the explicit forensic evidence of my father's embezzlement from his own corporate charity fund to pay for Victoria's multi-million-dollar reception. The countdown began the moment my heels clicked against the marble lobby of the St. Regis. While the classical quartet played for the arriving guests in the grand ballroom, I sat in the back of my town car, parked 2 blocks away, watching the digital pulse of my family's undoing on a secure tablet. Beside me sat Arthur Vance, my senior corporate counsel, a man whose legal career had been forged in the fires of high-stakes corporate liquidations. He was reviewing the final time-stamped courier receipts. The secondary packages have been delivered, Miss Wells, Arthur said, his voice a calm, rhythmic drone. The SEC Compliance Office received the forensic audit at exactly 3:15. The board of directors at Wells Global Development received their digital notifications 5 minutes ago. By the time the bride and groom cut the cake, the trading halt on your father's stock will be live. And the silver box? I asked, my eyes fixed on the live security feed of the hotel's reception area, which my security team had intercepted. Placed precisely on the primary gift table directly under the designated security camera, Arthur replied, a thin, humorless smile touching his lips. As instructed, it is labeled with a handwritten note. To Victoria and Julian, the foundation of your new beginning. To be opened privately before the grand entrance. Your sister's vanity will ensure she opens it. She can't resist a box that looks more expensive than the others. I looked out the window. The afternoon sun was catching the glass facade of the hotel. Inside that building, Eleanor was likely adjusting Victoria's veil, lecturing her on the importance of posture and reminding her that this day was the coronation of the Wells dynasty. They were completely insulated by their own arrogance, drunk on the perfume of wealth and social validation. They had spent years constructing a fortress of lies, using me as the basement where they hid their shame. But a fortress built on stolen capital and fraudulent ledgers is just a beautifully decorated house of cards. At 3:40, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, one of the catering staff my firm had secretly retained for the afternoon. The silver box has been moved to the bridal suite. The bride is asking for it now. It's time, Arthur, I said quietly. Activate the digital delivery to the guests. Understood, Miss Wells. Arthur tapped a final command into his laptop. With that single keystroke, an encrypted press release, backed by certified court filings and foreclosure notices, was blasted to every major financial media outlet in the city, as well as the personal email addresses of every single individual on the Saint Regis guest list. The high society crowds sitting in those velvet chairs wouldn't just hear rumors. They would have the raw, undeniable math of the Wells family's bankruptcy sitting right in the palms of their hands. I instructed my driver to circle back to the hotel. I wasn't going inside to beg for a seat. I wasn't going to stand in the back and scream. I was going to park across the street, in the cool, quiet shadows of the avenue, and watch the facade crumble from a safe, clinical distance. As the car pulled up to the curb opposite the Saint Regis awning, I saw the first wave of late-arriving guests stepping out of their limousines. They smiled, adjusted their black tie attire, and walked through the gold leaf doors, completely unaware that they were walking into an execution. The clock on the dashboard ticked to 4 o'clock. The ceremony was officially beginning. Deep inside the hotel, Victoria was walking down the aisle toward a man who thought he was marrying an heiress, escorted by a father who no longer owned the suit on his back. And in Victoria's private suite, resting on a white vanity, the silver box was waiting for the reception to start. The St. Regis Grand Ballroom was a masterclass in elitist opulence. 150 guests sat at tables draped in imported silk, illuminated by the warm amber glow of towering crystal chandeliers. The ceremony had concluded without a hitch. Victoria and Julian had exchanged vows, their union sealed under the watchful, triumphant eyes of Eleanor and Richard Wells. Now it was time for the grand reception. According to my contact inside the catering team, Victoria had insisted on opening her most exclusive gifts in the small holding room just behind the head table, immediately before their grand entrance. She wanted to wear whatever high-end jewelry she assumed was inside the silver box. I sat in the back of my darkened town car across the street, watching the ballroom's rear glass terrace through a pair of high-powered binoculars. On my lap, my tablet mirrored the internal security feed of the holding room. Victoria stood over the vanity, her heavy satin train pooled around her heels. Julian stood beside her, sipping scotch, looking utterly bored. Eleanor stepped into the frame, her face glowing with social victory. "Open the silver one first, darling!" Eleanor's voice filtered through my earpiece via the intercepted audio feed. "The wrapping is exquisite. It must be from the Harrison family." Victoria smiled, a sharp, greedy expression, and tore away the crimson ribbon. She lifted the heavy silver lid. Her smile faltered. Inside lay a sleek black flash drive and a stack of crisp, notarized legal documents. On the top page, stamped in bold crimson ink, were the words, "Notice of immediate foreclosure and asset seizure." "What is this?" Victoria murmured, her voice laced with sudden irritation. "Is this a joke? Where is the jewelry?" Julian leaned over, his eyes scanning the first page. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His glass of scotch slipped from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. The amber liquid splattered across the hem of Victoria's pristine white gown. "Julian, look at my dress!" Victoria shrieked. "Shut up, Victoria," Julian whispered, his voice trembling as he grabbed the documents. "Richard! Eleanor! Get in here right now!" Richard Wells stepped into the room, his chest puffed out in his tailored tuxedo. "What is the meaning of? Look at this!" Julian shoved the papers into my father's chest. "Your flagship building, your Hamptons estate, the corporate accounts, they've all been seized. The lender is Vanguard Wells Holdings. Richard, it says here, your firm is under an active federal investigation for embezzlement. The trading halt went live 20 minutes ago." "That's impossible," Richard stammered, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the forensic ledgers. "Vanguard Wells is an anonymous private equity fund. I negotiated with their front attorneys. Look at the flash drive, Dad," Victoria cried out. panic finally breaking through her vanity. Julian slammed the flash drive into the laptop, resting on the vanity. The screen flickered to life, automatically projecting its contents onto the massive digital seating chart screen inside the main ballroom via the hotel's synchronized media network. It was an automated override code I had embedded into the drive months ago. In an instant, the beautiful, looping calligraphy of the guest names vanished from the ballroom screens. In its place, giant high-definition scans of my father's fraudulent balance sheets, his signed personal guarantees, and the explicit termination notices of Victoria's trust fund flooded the room. Through the ballroom windows, I saw the exact moment the chaos erupted. 150 high society guests stared up at the screens in collective, horrified fascination. Cell phones began buzzing simultaneously across every single table as the digital press releases and court filings hit their inboxes. Mrs. Harrison gasped, dropped her champagne flute, and immediately began typing on her phone. The whispers turned into a deafening roar of scandal. Back in the holding room, the unraveling was absolute. "Who did this?" Eleanor screamed, her polished mask completely fracturing. She grabbed the silver box, turning it over until she saw the small, elegant card tucked into the velvet lining. She read it aloud, her voice cracking with pure horror. "Congratulations on a perfect merger." From Myra Wells, CEO of Vanguard Wells Holdings. Richard collapsed into a chair, his face ash gray, his hands clutching his chest as he realized the daughter he had discarded now owned his very life. Victoria began to wail, dropping to her knees on the stained floor, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks as Julian violently tore his wedding bonnier from his lapel and stormed out of the room, shouting for his family's attorneys. They were completely destroyed, stripped of their dignity in front of the only people whose opinions they cared about. I turned off the tablet. The feed went black. Within seconds, my phone began to vibrate violently. My mother's name flashed across the screen, then my father's, then Victoria's. The screen lit up like a Christmas tree, an endless, desperate barrage of calls and texts flooding in. I didn't answer. I leaned back against the leather seat, closed my eyes, and spoke to my driver. "Take me home, Marcus," I said calmly. "We're done here." By 9 o'clock the following morning, the Wells name was toxic. I sat in my office on the 42nd floor, looking out over the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass. On the polished mahogany desk sat a cup of black coffee and 3 morning newspapers. The financial tabloids had gone to press late, but they had managed to catch the explosion. "Society Wedding of the Year ends in bankruptcy and bail," the headline read, accompanied by a blurry, high-resolution photo of Victoria sobbing under the saint. Regis awning, her ruined dress clutched in her hands as Julian's family sped away in a separate limousine. The digital fallout was even more severe. A clip recorded by one of the catering staff, showing the exact moment my father's fraudulent ledgers flashed across the ballroom's grand screens, had gone viral on social media. It had accumulated 6 million views overnight. The comments were a bloodbath of public mockery. The elite circle my mother had spent her entire life courting had deleted her from their group chats by midnight. "Miss Wells," Arthur Vance said, stepping into my office with a sleek leather folder. "The collapse is absolute. Julian's father released an official statement an hour ago announcing that their family is filing for an immediate annulment of the marriage. They are citing material misrepresentation and fraud." "And my father's board?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "They voted unanimously at 7 a.m. to remove Richard Wells as CEO," Arthur replied, his voice flat and precise. "The bank has frozen his corporate accounts based on the forensic evidence we provided to the SEC. Furthermore, the luxury dealership has already dispatched tow trucks to repossess Victoria's new vehicle. The family has no liquidity left to fight the foreclosures. They were being systematically erased from the world they thought they owned. The country club had suspended their memberships. Their friends were suddenly unreachable. Their phone lines were dead to everyone except their creditors. Suddenly, my private line buzzed. It wasn't my parents or Victoria. I looked down at the caller ID, Julian's father, Charles Vance, tech chairman. I pressed the speakerphone button. "Speak, Myra," Charles's voice came through, devoid of its usual billionaire bluster. He sounded old, tired, and deeply humiliated. "I want to clarify that my family had no part in your father's financial misconduct. We were completely blindsided by Richard's desperation." "I know, Charles," I said coldly. "That's why I left your tech fund's debt intact instead of liquidating it yesterday. I wanted you to see the true value of the family you were merging with." There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear him shifting in his leather chair. You hold the best master on our primary commercial development now. If you call that debt, my family's fund collapses alongside the Wells estate. I'm calling to ask, what are your terms, Myra? Name them. We can settle this privately. My terms are simple, Charles, I said, my voice cutting like a scalpel. You will proceed with the public annulment. You will ensure Victoria receives absolutely nothing from your family's assets. And when my firm initiates the public auction of my father's flagship building next week, you will stand before the press and state that Vanguard Wells Holdings is the only institution capable of stabilizing the market. A slow, defeated breath came through the receiver. Understood. I will have my public relations team draft the statement immediately. Myra, I had no idea you were the intellect behind Vanguard. If your parents had simply... My parents got exactly what they negotiated for, I interrupted smoothly. Goodbye, Charles. I hung up before he could offer his useless, belated respect. As the sun rose higher, casting sharp shadows across my desk, I received a notification on my personal tablet, a delivery confirmation. The foreclosure notices had just been physically pinned to the front gates of my parents' Hamptons estate. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, security notified me that Eleanor and Richard Wells were standing in the lobby of my corporate headquarters. They hadn't been granted access to the secure elevators, of course. They were sitting on the minimalist leather benches downstairs, surrounded by pristine glass and bustling tech executives, looking like ghosts from a bygone era. Bring them up, Arthur, I said through the intercom. Just the two of them. Leave Victoria in the lobby if she's with them. Understood, Miss Wells. When the heavy frosted glass doors of my office slid open, my parents walked in. The transformation was striking. The immaculate, untouchable posture my mother had championed for decades was entirely gone. Her designer coat looked hastily thrown on, and her hair, usually sculpted into a perfect shell, was slightly frayed. My father looked physically diminished, his shoulders slumped inside a charcoal suit that suddenly looked too large for him. They stopped at the edge of the room, staring across the vast expanse of polished concrete toward my desk. Mira, Eleanor began, her voice cracking before she quickly tightened it into her familiar commanding register. This madness has gone far enough. Look at what you've done to your sister. Look at what you've done to your father's health. We have press camped outside our home. Repossession agents are at the gate. Turn this digital circus off immediately. I didn't stand up. I didn't smile. I slowly closed the laptop on my desk and folded my hands. You're misreading the room, Eleanor, I said, my tone flat, level, and entirely devoid of heat. You aren't in a position to issue directives. You are standing in my building looking at the person who holds your eviction notices. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched, though his eyes betrayed a profound, desperate terror. Myra, please, we didn't know. If you had just told us what you were achieving, if you had shared your success with the family. Shared it? I interrupted, a faint, humorless twist at the corner of my lips. Like you shared Victoria's milestones? Like the loan you laughed at when I asked for a chance to prove myself? You didn't want my success, Richard. You wanted my compliance. You needed me to be the failure so Victoria could look like a masterpiece. That is entirely unfair, Eleanor snapped, stepping closer, her manicured fingers trembling. We gave you everything. A private education, a roof over your head, your trust fund. The trust fund you threatened to audit yesterday because I sat in a chair I wasn't approved for? I looked directly at her, watching her flinch. You gave me capital to keep me quiet, Eleanor, but you forgot that capital grows when it's managed by someone with a brain. I took the scraps you threw at me and bought the debt on every single luxury asset you used to look down on me. We are your parents, Myra. Richard's voice cracked, a pathetic, hollow echo of the man who used to dismiss me with a wave of his hand. We made you who you are. No, I said, standing up slowly. The sheer physical presence of my movement made them both step back automatically. You ignored me into who I am. You left me alone in the dark, and all I did was learn how to map the terrain. I don't owe you an explanation, and I certainly don't owe you forgiveness. Eleanor stared at me, the reality of her complete powerlessness finally settling into her eyes. The coldness she had spent 25 years weaponizing against me was now reflecting right back at her, multiplied by a factor of millions. What do you want from us? She whispered, her voice finally breaking. Are you going to leave us on the street? Your own family? You will sell the townhouse, I said, my voice cutting through the room like dry ice. You will liquidate whatever minor personal assets the bank hasn't frozen yet, and you will move into a modest apartment outside the city limits. You will never use the Wells Global name for credit again. And most importantly, you will never call my private line, step into this building, or look for me at an event again. Myra, please! Richard stammered, reaching a hand out. The boundary is absolute, Richard, I said, sitting back down and opening my laptop, completely dismissing their presence. If you cross it, I will accelerate the foreclosure on your primary residence from 30 days to 48 hours. Arthur will escort you to the service elevator. They stood there for 3 agonizing seconds, waiting for a crack in my armor, a hint of tears, a sign that I was doing this out of anger. But anger is an emotional investment, and I had completely divested from them years ago. Seeing that they were staring at a stone wall, my father slowly turned away. My mother followed him, her head bowed, her heels dragging against the floor. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them, sealing them out of my life forever. The auction of Wells Global Development's flagship tower took exactly 12 minutes. I didn't attend the public bidding in the courthouse rotunda. Instead, I watched the live stream from the terrace of my newly acquired penthouse overlooking Central Park. As the hammer fell on the final devastatingly low bid, Vanguard Wells Holdings officially took ownership of the property. The anchor of my father's identity now belonged to my corporate portfolio. The fallout across the family was permanent and unyielding. With Charles Vance Tech's public relations machinery completely aligned with my terms, the annulment of Victoria's marriage was finalized within weeks. She received nothing. The high society wedding she had weaponized to humiliate me became her permanent social obituary. The luxury fashion boutique she once flaunted closed its doors after its primary lines of credit, which I controlled, were quietly discontinued. She now lives in a rented 2-bedroom apartment upstate, completely abandoned by the social circle that once fueled her vanity. My parents retired to a modest gray shingle house miles outside the city lines, completely detached from the country clubs, the galas, and the elite networking that Eleanor had valued more than her own flesh and blood. They exist now as ghosts of a minor dynasty, living off the restricted remains of a heavily audited pension, completely aware that every roof over their heads exists solely because I allow it to. On a crisp autumn evening, Aunt Clara joined me on the terrace. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city lights below us. They settled the keys to the Hamptons estate today, Clara said, her voice holding the deep, quiet satisfaction of an architect watching her blueprint become reality. Eleanor tried to leave a box of your old childhood academic medals with the real estate agent. She asked if they could be forwarded to this address. Did you take them? I asked, not turning around. No, Clara replied smoothly. I told them we don't store debris in this building. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. For years, I had believed that the only way to heal from emotional neglect was to force the people who hurt you to finally see you. I thought I needed their validation, their apology, or their tears. But as I watched the city pulse beneath my feet, completely independent and untouchable, I realized the ultimate truth of power. True reclamation isn't about forcing them to admit they were wrong. It's about building a life so vast, so clinical, and so extraordinarily successful that their opinions simply ceased to matter. They had spent decades trying to keep me small, using their wealth as a cage and their favoritism as a weapon. In their desperation to protect an illusion of perfection, they had completely underestimated the daughter who actually understood the architecture of their world. They broke their own empire trying to lock me out of it. I raised my glass to the cold, silent skyline. The game was over. The ledgers were perfectly balanced. And for the first time in 25 years, the silence around me didn't feel like neglect. It felt like victory, and that is how the Wells dynasty crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I let the math do the talking. What was your favorite twist? Let me know in the comments below. If you want more high-stakes, realistic emotional revenge stories that expose the dark side of high society, smash that like button, subscribe to Whispered Wrongs, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single drop. Remember, the most dangerous predator is the one you choose to ignore. See you in the next video.